The problem is you do see a lot of antisocial people succeed. Loneliness is as big a risk factor for ill health and death.
We live inside our heads.
You go cold turkey, you go into withdrawal.
There is a lot of value in the stuff that we struggle with.
Better Thinking. Conversations with experts exploring all things psychology. Welcome back to Better Thinking. My name's Nesh Nikolic, and my guest today is Ben Newell, who is here to talk to us about the role of behavioural science in promoting climate action. Ben is Professor of Behavioural Science in the School of Psychology at UNSW Sydney and Director of the UNSW Institute for Climate Risk and Response. His research focuses on the cognitive processes underlying judgment, choice, and decision-making, and the application of this knowledge to environmental, medical, financial, and forensic contexts. His role in the new institute is to drive an interdisciplinary research agenda, bringing together expertise from behavioural science, climate science, economics, and governance to address the risks and opportunities of climate change. He has published multiple articles on the psychology of human judgment and decision-making, including those that lie at the intersection of psychology and climate change, with a particular focus on the understanding of uncertainty and risk. Ben is lead author of the books Straight Choices, The Psychology of Decision-Making, and Open-Minded, A Search for the Truth About the Unconscious Mind. Ben is a member of the Academic Advisory Panel of Behavioural Economics team of the Australian Government and the Chief Medical Officers Advisory Group for the National Health and Climate Strategy. It was a fascinating conversation with Ben. It was lovely to talk to him not only about the role of behavioural science in promoting climate action, but also seeing how he thinks about this wider topic and some of the overarching wider principles about how people take on messages and where some of our biases lie. Enjoy. Ben, a big thank you for coming onto the program today. Really looking forward to discussing the role of behavioural science and how we go out and look at promoting action in the environment, particularly around climate action, and I know beyond as well. With you have a passion around decision making and judgment and the like. So really looking at things broadly. Appreciate your time.
It's a pleasure.
I always like to start with how did you get into this space of looking at whether it's the behaviour science side or integrated into climate action or decision making judgments. Where did this passion come from, and how did you find yourself there?
Yeah, it's a good question. I started off, I don't know how far back you want to go, but I started off in high school studying sciences. So I did my schooling in the UK. I'm from the UK. And in the UK, in years 11 and 12, you only study 3 subjects, which my kids are always amazed to hear. And the subjects that I studied were biology, physics, and chemistry. And so I was into, the hard science, if you like. And at the end of those 3 years, I found that I'd enjoyed that, and I'd enjoyed the scientific method. I enjoyed understanding how you can establish, causal inference, and the beauty in an experimental design that allows you to draw conclusions and solid inferences. And I started to think about how that could be applied, not maybe just to physics or chemistry or biology, but to the way we think, the way we understand, the way we make decisions. And I hadn't studied psychology at all before at school, but I thought it would be an interesting subject to go to university and study, with a fairly naive base to it. And so I did that. I went to Nottingham University in the UK, right in the centre of the UK. I grew up in the southwest of England, and then went to Nottingham in the UK, studied there for 3 years, and really enjoyed it, and had a passion and a growing passion, I think, through those 3 years for realising that you can use science, you can use scientific method to understand behaviour. And to me, there's nothing more interesting than understanding why people do the things that they do, and whether or not we can develop our own understanding of that, which is a complex process. So at the end of those 3 years, I wanted to carry on into studying psychology. But again, I didn't want to do it straight away. And so I actually spent a few years working and traveling. I spent a few years in Japan teaching English. And then at the end of that time, I came to Australia. I got a scholarship to come and study here in Sydney. Did a PhD focusing on the idea that people can learn unconsciously, so that you can learn complex new information kind of without attention. And that developed a long-running interest of mine into what the unconscious can and can't do when it comes to learning and cognition. I then went back to the UK, did a postdoc back at University College London for a few years, and then found myself back in Sydney in a lectureship position. And I've been here since then, actually. So I've now been at UNSW about 20 plus years this year, I guess. And I'm a professor here. And the shift into the climate and understanding climate behavior and understanding the relevance of behavioral science for climate started probably about 10 to 15 years ago, when we were sort of at there's been so many different climate wars, I guess, in Australia. But this was at the time when there was sort of a high point of enthusiasm when Kevin Rudd came in 2007. People were very keen for there to be climate action. We'd signed up to the Kyoto Protocol. There was a lot of enthusiasm. Al Gore's movie had come out. People were very, there was a lot of discussion about, we need to do something. And then slowly things began to shift. The political climate began to shift. And there was a rise in, if you like, people starting to question the science on climate change, trying to raise doubts in people's mind about whether this was something that we need to worry about. And at the time, I'd started working with one of the climate scientists here at UNSW, Andy Pittman. And it really came out of conversations with him and fellow climate scientists about their frustration that their message wasn't getting out. And they were saying, you guys think you know about how people make decisions and how they understand information and how we can communicate. What can we do? How can we change the way we're talking about things to get people to understand what they need to do? So I started to think about the work that I'd been doing on understanding risky choice, understanding people's interpretations of uncertainty, and how that related to issues around climate and climate change. And since then, that became an interest of mine, initially kind of on the side. It was an extra thing that I was doing. But in the last couple of years, since establishing this new institute at UNSW for climate risk and response, I'm now the director of, it's become much more of a focus of mine. And the focus now is to acknowledge that dealing with climate change is an interdisciplinary issue. It's not something that one single discipline and one single body of knowledge can address on its own. And so the Institute is bringing together people who have expertise in the physical climate science, also in economics, in business, in the legal aspects of climate litigation, but also to bring that kind of behavioral lens as a glue that brings all of those different perspectives together, because ultimately it's about the way in which people behave, the way in which they make decisions, and the way in which we can gain a deeper understanding of the factors that are changing the climate and what we can or can't do about them. So it's a pretty long-winded answer, but maybe it's gives you some idea.
It is very interesting because the complexity around behavior change, whether it's in climate action or any other, is always so high. The messaging that we hear quite regularly in all forms of media tend to show that there are often two opposing viewpoints, and I'm not always sure why it falls on two rather than on four opposing, or several different. It's almost like we hold one or the other. There's an immediate opposition to two things, whether that's a political thing or it's what captures eyeballs. Maybe you could potentially fill in some of the reasons of that, or at least theories behind that, because it seems like it's always a dichotomy, for or against, rather than a curiosity around. I mean, I still struggle with trying to understand the changing climates. That what are the contributors? I don't have any reservation or queries around, is the globe warming up. I have to believe that the scientists have got this right. Why would they say something if it's not? But the reasons I think are so complicated. What are the primary contributors? There's just so much nonsense that goes on that it just confuses people. And unless you're going to take a deep dive yourself, and then hopefully you're not going to be selective in what you're deep diving in as well, it's really hard to filter through all the information, because the layperson like myself, I don't have any knowledge. Even the terminology that's used is beyond me. If we look at how many parts per million, particles, we're going towards this number of 400 or something. Who knows? We've probably gone beyond that now.
Yeah.
All these things, I don't even know how to interpret that.
Yeah. No, I agree. It's all at a very abstract level. And one of the things that's very interesting, I think, is the degree to which people, or the variability in the degree to which people need that level of understanding in order to inform their own behavior or make changes in it. And I think, as you say, knowing whether the current measure is 400 parts per million or 420 or 417, or really at some level doesn't matter for some people, right? They've like you were saying yourself, if you have an understanding of science and scientific method, or you have a respect, if you like, for science and the scientific practice, then there's a degree to which you should take that information on trust. Because, as you say, why would this whole idea of global warming be talked about if there wasn't some underlying truth to it? But for other people, they say, no, you're wrong. You can't just take this stuff on trust. And they will go and do their own deep dive. And sometimes that deep dive will take them in places that raise more questions than answers for them. And I think, there's plenty of data out there suggesting that if you can explain some aspects of the carbon cycle, and we've done work on this, that you do start to bring people along a bit of a journey where a penny drops, and okay, so that's what's happening. Even if it's just a step towards understanding why it is that burning fossil fuels leads to the emissions of CO2, and that CO2 getting trapped inside the atmosphere is what's leading to this heating up, the old greenhouse effect we probably studied when we were in high school. And you don't necessarily need to understand the chemistry behind how that's working and why it is that it's being trapped and why the buildup is a problem. But getting that sense that there's a increasingly thick blanket, if you like, around the planet that is keeping us warmer than we should be, is a way of contributing for some people towards that understanding. And there's old work suggesting that there's not a direct one-to-one connection between people's scientific literacy and their willingness to accept action on climate change. The thing that seems to drive it more is the particular worldview or political orientation that people have. And that, to me, is, again, a fundamentally interesting finding, because it sort of pushes the problem one step further back. Well, why is that then? Why is it that particular political orientation makes people more or less accepting of what's going on? We've got a recent paper that people at the Institute, Omid Ghassemi, who's a postdoc of mine, and Samantha Stanley, who's an ARC Discovery Fellow, have been working on a project all about trust in scientists and trust in climate scientists. And they find in a global sample of like 70,000 people that there's a gap between trust in science in general and trust in climate science, such that trust in climate science is significantly lower in lots and lots of countries than trust in science. And that gap is predicted by, or partly predicted by, again, political orientation. So whether you see yourself as more of a left-leaning, more of a right-leaning or right-voting person. And so, yeah, the facts are complex. For some people, they matter. For some people, they don't. As you know, coming at it initially, my first sort of forays into working in this area were through the lens of a cognitive psychologist, right? So someone who is interested in how people understand information, how they make judgments, how they think about uncertainty in information. And so I have my own, I think, bias towards thinking, well, if you can explain the facts and you can explain the information, then surely people will understand what needs to happen. But of course, as you're saying, it's complex and it's not immediate still. I mean, before we got on, we were exchanging stories about storms that have recently hit our various locations that we're speaking from. And that's an increasing reality that we're all now seeing. And I think that part of the conversation about, is climate change a thing that we need to be worrying about? Is it a thing that's happening? Has mostly moved on now, right? There's not a huge amount of people left who are saying it's not a thing, we don't need to worry about it. The debate now is shifted obviously towards, well, how bad is it going to be? And what are the kinds of things that we need to do? What are the solutions? And so there's a whole nother, area of discussion around solution uncertainty and what are the measures that we should be taking to address it. And again, that links back to, well, if you don't understand the mechanisms, you don't understand what it is that's driving it in the first place, then that has implications for the kinds of changes that you might need to adopt, or that we as society should be adopting if we're going to see movement on climate.
It's so fascinating as you're talking, my mind's kind of trying to see my own biases. And I know that there's a part of me that likes to question statements and statements like, there's increasing weather events. It's funny how that doesn't stick very strongly with me. But if someone were to actually give me some, numbers and say, since this period, we've seen an increase in X amount of percent, somehow that logic that, you were talking about or evidence might be stickier. It's so interesting. Yet if I kind of ask the question around, this global warming space, I make my own evidence up and kind of just say, well, there must be just something true about this because all these scientists are talking about it. But I still query the two messages of where's it coming from? Is it the CO2 trapped? And for me, it becomes irrelevant because in my mind, I'm like, but we just kind of know that burning things ongoingly across the world is just not healthy. Period.
Yeah.
So for me, the whole thing is kind of irrelevant. And in actual fact, sometimes is even a little bit infuriating because I think it then creates a debate about should we do something rather than saying it's really not good to burn things.
Yeah.
We know this because cigarette smokers know that it's not healthy for them. And you kind of appreciate that if you take one inhale, you will start coughing and they're like, oh, this is why we run away from fires. They engulf you and that's how most people, die in fires. So it's really fascinating how I start just creating my own evidence, my own rationale, my own stories that I suppose informs many of my own, viewpoints and decisions. It's interesting to watch oneself.
Yeah.
While you're talking.
Yeah. Well, I think that's true. I mean, that idea of, creating your own narrative and why you make the decisions that you make and having an understanding of it is one of the things, again, I think that makes psychology such a fascinating but challenging discipline, right? I mean, it's one of the things that we talk about in first year. And I used to run the first year psych program here at UNSW and the sort of almost the first lecture of Site 1A, you're trying to get across to students that everyone has a theory of their own behavior, right? Everyone has an understanding of why you do the things that you do. And what we're trying to do in psychology is bring a scientific lens to that goes beyond that goes beyond the simple intuitions that you might have for your own behavior. That doesn't necessarily mean that those intuitions are wrong, or that the narrative that you're creating for yourself is entirely false. But there are times where you are going to get, the wrong intuition, and there are other times when you don't, or when your narrative works and when it doesn't. I mean, you're the clinician here, so you're dealing with this kind of stuff in a different way. But I do think that's a challenge that doesn't face other sciences, where the focus is not on the way that the subject of study is thinking.
And what would you say are the primary levers, if you will, or contributors to behavior change? I know that something that's interesting is that one's worldview by itself has so much capacity in explaining how someone goes out and makes their decisions, irrespective of what information is provided. And maybe that was a bit too broad of a statement, but what's the research telling us in particularly in climate action? What are these levers that are most well understood as to why have we got people holding a position, finding it difficult to change their position, whether either side, irrespective, or people who are more centrist. What is it about trust, messaging? The political stuff is always an interesting one, because that tends to scratch your head all the time about the messaging there. Maybe you could talk us through a little bit, on that space.
Yeah, I mean, I think that when it comes to climate, the worldview aspect and the kind of political affiliation is a strong driver. It is something that, for reasons that I guess are fairly ingrained in terms of, I mean, one of the variables that seems to come out in some studies, at least in terms of predicting people's willingness to behave in a pro-environmental way, are things like beliefs in the free market, and whether you think that the market in and of itself is going to achieve solutions, and thinking that that's a better direction to go in than, say, government policy or government action. So I think that is a driver that is dominant in climate. I mean, my own experience and approach, I guess, to thinking about behavior change. So I'm not a health psych person. I'm a cognitive or judgment and decision making. Has been my main topic of interest, and that field has been, in recent years, the approach to thinking about how to get people to change the decisions that they make, or the ways in which they choose or decide, has been heavily influenced by the work of people like Amos Tversky and Danny Kahneman, and also since their work sort of inspiring the behavioral economics approach and things like choice architectures and nudging. So that those two sort of more technical terms, but simply put, a choice architecture is the idea that the way in which things are arranged for us in our environment, so you can think about it in a supermarket, and that where things are placed on a shelf will make it easier for us to choose some things over other things, or will make some things more salient in our environment than other things. Setting options as the default choice, so the effortless choice, is another way of changing a choice architecture. So if I make buying carbon offsets when you get a flight, the default, or I make green energy power the default when you sign up for an electricity provider, then lots of research shows that you're more likely to stick with that default option. And whether that's because it's easier and I'm lazy and I can't be bothered to think about it, and or there's a sort of implied endorsement or message coming from the person that set that default. If it's set as a default, then presumably that person wants me to choose it. Therefore, maybe I end up sticking with it. And so those kinds of small changes in our environment can lead to larger changes in behavior. So I think that those, and there's, you know, theory behind that in the judgment decision-making area that allows you to build up those sorts of nudges, changes, small changes in the environment that can shift people's choices. Now, I think that that's an important insight. It's one route, if you like, into changing behavior that can be relevant for climate. I don't think it's the only route by any means. And I think one of the places in which this kind of nudge approach has become overemphasized or there's been too much promise, if you like, put behind it, is the idea that people are not really engaged in their decision making and their choosing particularly, and that they can be kind of swayed and pushed around just by changing small things in the environment, and that's going to have really large changes on their behavior. I think in some cases, if it's, you know, relatively small, low cost choices, then that can happen. But I think you've also got to respect people's agency and their own motives and their own representation. It's a bit going back to what we were talking about before with the narrative. And we've just actually recently, with a colleague of mine, Abba Solosi, published a paper that's called Nudges for People Who Think. And the idea behind that title is that we can't just go with this notion that people are sort of sitting there passively being pushed into one decision or another. People have a representation of a problem. Again, you know, I might be highly literate in terms of the science underlying climate change, but I hold a fundamental belief that whatever I personally do in terms of my own personal behavior is not going to have a tiny bit of difference on the changing of the planet. So I'm going to keep driving my high polluting car. I'm going to keep flying everywhere. I'm going to keep, you know, whatever, because it really, really, at the end of it, doesn't make any difference. And that's not because, you know, I can understand what you're trying to get me to do as the person changing the choice architecture. But I still don't want to do it. Or it might be that I don't want to do it because my representation of the problem is actually wrong. So I don't understand, you know, how CO2 emissions affect the planet. And maybe, therefore, I might be in a position to be given that information in a way that helps me understand it, and I will change. But then we're back to probably not, because maybe there's my worldview and my political orientation. So I think to try and get back to the specific question of what are the social levers, or what are the levers, there are things like choice architecture, the way we set up the problem. There's also things like observing the behavior of people around us and seeing, you know, the standard kind of social norms type effects. If we understand that more people are engaging in particular behaviors, or we understand that there's been a shift. You were talking before about, you know, if you saw some stats on, and I was going to say at the time, if you go and look at any big insurance company or reinsurance companies, if you want to see what the rise in natural climate related disasters have been over time, then their reports are good sources for those. But similarly, if, you know, there's plenty of experiments showing that people's behavior will be shifted by realizing that there's a change in the norm, like a dynamic change in the norm of, say, people becoming vegetarian, or people adopting other sorts of pro-climate related behaviors. Not that vegetarianism is necessarily always driven by climate, but so those kinds of things play out, I think, in ways that we can start to kind of lean into and understand what the mechanisms are underlying them that then can help us drive people's change. So it's things like, you know, the salience of options in the environment, our motivation to want to change, and our representation of the problem, whether our representation matches that of the person whose behaviour, who is trying to change our behaviour.
It's so fascinating when we look at how they all relate with one another. You know, whether it's the choice architecture, I often use the word friction. You know, when it's high friction somewhere versus low friction.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
The social media companies have absolutely mastered that with, you know, an infinite number of selections that make it so complicated that we just say, you know what, just leave it on the default.
Yeah, yeah.
Which is no different to if you're looking to sign up to let's say, you know, a phone service, a telecommunication service. They're so complicated in how well, at least they previously were. I don't know. But I remember they were so complicated that you would just go on brand recognition because you just cannot go and compare one with another. That none of them are apples with apples, and so you just say, you know what, go with brand, or go with, if you're price sensitive, whatever it might be. I can see that, and then the other side, that social proof.
Yeah.
You know, what's the current you know, right thing to do? And obviously there's personality attributes about whether someone's a contrarian or you know, they're questioning things. But I love also how you can also believe two things simultaneously, like, you know, yes, there's a problem here, but my contribution here doesn't make a difference.
That juxtaposition was very stark for me. We organized a workshop towards the end of last year that was focusing on climate litigation and looking at, you know, the kind of cases that have been brought against large oil and gas companies, you know, looking to open up new mines. And there's a climate scientist from ANU, Nerily Abrams, who gave a really nice talk where she was sort of taking a critical analysis of the risk assessments that companies do of the impact of new, let's say, gas exploration. And this is going to sound a bit, I'll get back to how this relates to what you mentioned in a minute, but the point of it being that they do this risk assessment and they say, well, you know, the amount of CO2 that this particular project will release into the atmosphere is so small in the scale of things, in the worldwide scale of, you know, it's infinitesimal, that we can't identify, you know, it being a direct contribution to the change in climate, because it's just too small. So in some ways, it's like them saying, well, you know, I'm going to fill this bottle with water, but because I can't actually identify any particular drop that goes in as contributing to the height of the water in this bottle, that drop doesn't matter. And you listen to that and you think, that's utter rubbish, right? How can a corporation make that kind of a claim? And you know, you immediately, I think most people would say, no, that doesn't pass the pub test, not going with that. But at the same time, simultaneously, you can hold the belief that, yeah, but nothing that I do is going to contribute to the impact on the climate, right? Because it's tiny. You know, how can you tell me that the contributions that I made from flying from X to Y is going to, it's the same thing. And I made this point to a colleague and he said, oh yeah, it's the same thing, but the fossil fuel company is doing it just to make profit, and you're doing it because it, you know, is the way you're living your life. And I was like, yeah, is that different? I'm not sure. You know, so the moral calculus in all of this is fundamental. And again, actually, I wrote a paper a couple of years back with a colleague from philosophy here, Jeremy Moss, who's done excellent work on looking at kind of climate justice and carbon justice, and he and I were sort of writing a paper about the moral case for taking action on climate because of that, the claim that, well, my action doesn't make any difference. And so, but if you start to explore the kind of moral underpinnings of, well, if I know an action that I'm taking is going to cause harm, then I should not take that action. Or if I think I'm part of a collective, then I should be willing to do my fair share of what it means to be living in that collective. Then those sorts of moral positions can provide that additional motivation or additional justification, if you like, for why my behavior should change. The other thing I think that comes up often when I talk about these kinds of issues about, well, my behavior doesn't make any difference, is that, and this is also something that's interestingly been playing out in the behavioral literature, is why is there all this emphasis on what I should be doing when clearly what needs to change is, more system level, if you like, systemic change at societal level, or corporations being properly managed so that they aren't going into more coal and gas expansion or whatever it might be, and that there's been a whole divergence or taking away of the focus of where the change really needs to happen, which is onto the societal level, corporation level. And a good example of this is something that Michael Mann, who's a very well-known climate scientist from the US, wrote about in one of his recent books, which is the fact that the first carbon footprint calculator, so the idea that you can go and figure out how much my particular actions are contributing, was developed by BP, big oil company, right? And so they arguably trying to shift responsibility on the consumer and say, it's kind of the drug dealer's defense of, well, I'm just giving you the drugs, I don't know what you want to do with them, and that it's a clever tactic. It's similar logic with the recycling of drinks containers by big like Coke and people like that. It was always pushed back on the consumer. You need to be doing this. You need to be changing, and the responsibility should be more on society. And that's come out in the behavioural literature. There's been a lot of discussion recently about there being too much emphasis on nudges at the individual level behaviour, when it should be that we're thinking about how to design systems more effectively to allow these bigger shifts and bigger changes in behaviour to occur.
It's interesting when you do look at a problem, we almost go back to that dichotomy again of who's responsible rather than a collective responsibility. We tend to go and say it's this or that. If one is more than the other, then it's like, let's just focus on the one that's more rather than the other's contribution as well. And it's fascinating to see how basic human decision making boils down to. We just go out and produce these dichotomies and run with those.
Yeah.
Similarly with that whole idea of the free market will fix it. That's a classic one of mine because I love and I'm interested in technology.
Yeah,
I've got these fantasies that float around in my mind that robotics are going to come in, and no matter what we do, at the present moment, not that I don't use my bins correctly at home and the like, but my fantasy is that these robots and machines will effectively just mine our great reserves of rubbish tips, and these places are full of gold in various materials and the like. I still believe that. I think that's a genuine thing. The raw materials are there, but it's almost like technology will save us. while we all continue to consume it at a ridiculous rate. There's this culture of just consumption. But Ben, it'll all be good because technology will fix it up.
Yeah, I mean that's I get that. I've made this comment on a few different platforms and panels and that over the last year or two, that the single simplest piece of advice is to consume less, right? To consume differently. Yeah. So, should I get an EV? Well, yeah, probably, but maybe don't get a car. And that's easy to say if you don't need one, but yeah, I mean, consuming less seems to me to be a fairly obvious thing to do, and yet there's still, and I think marketing as a discipline, I mean, there's a huge rise and shift in marketing as well towards thinking about more sustainable practice and more sustainable, but there's that weird kind of, it's almost the antithesis of what marketing is about, right? Marketing is about getting people to buy stuff, more stuff. And so trying to come up with a way of using marketing to address the fundamental idea that we should consume less is a tricky one. But yeah, coming back to that the dichotomy, I agree that saying, should we focus on individual level or system level is, again, silly. It's got to be both. And you can't get changes in a system without having the people who are part of that system, the individuals within it, being on board and agreeing with a particular path of action that we should be taking. You're not going to get those fundamental level changes if you don't get the society on board.
What's your viewpoint on, to me, that if we go back to that consumption side, it seems like in many ways that is quite a significant contributor. If demand is not there, then we just don't dig up those resources and we just don't use them. If I were to read a book and then I can hand it to the next person who reads the book, and if there's 15 people who read the book, it's far superior than I just read the book and I burn it. We can see the footprint there, and very simple ones of walking to the shops rather than driving. But at the same time, if I'm physically have a vehicle, but I'm not driving it very much, but it still gets replaced at the same time period, there's inherently still a quite a large footprint there as well, whether it's battery or not. And I love battery vehicles. I think they're phenomenal. But there's still a consumption side. And sometimes the argument gets even complicated, where marketers are clearly going out there, and I don't know who pays for this messaging, or I don't even know if it's genuine or not, but I've heard things that seem odd to me, like claims that electric vehicles are much worse for the environment. And some of them even moved to things like the particles that come off the tires are greater than the particles that come off ICE engine because the vehicles are heavier. And so if you only hear the headline says that EVs are worse. If you read further into it, it's saying EVs use more tires. Obviously, if I've got a leaning in one direction, I'll solve it very quickly, and I'll say, let's get harder tires or something like that wear more. Tires don't actually need to. The tires are not the problem in my mind. I think it's how we use them. But I can see there's this messaging that is going on, whether it's consumption, or the EVs are better or that they're worse. It seems like we don't cope very well and I can put my hand up myself and just say, I don't cope well with decision making, because I just simply cannot get through the information. I can't find trustworthy sources. If they are trustworthy, I don't trust that I can even pick it either, because I think there's too many blind spots. I think we end up just going back to this default of, oh, it's overwhelming, and you just make a decision. You kind of forget about the whole problem and get back into work because I've got clients to see and I've got to pick up my kids, and we just throw it all in the bin, you know. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that, the overwhelm with the messaging, in that, obviously we're still trying to promote some type of messaging, whether it's one side or the other or everything in between as well. But we're pretty fraught with how we even adopt something. Why? What are the challenges that the individual faces?
I mean, I share your. I think that characterization is right. I have a postcard on the door of my office here that that my parents actually sent me quite a long time ago now, and it's a postcard that has 2 check boxes on it. It says yes, no, and the question is, are you indecisive? And the card shows someone who's ticked yes and then scribbled it out and then put the cross. And there may be some connection between my area of research and my state of mind. So yeah, I'm a horrible decision maker for a lot of the reasons that you just articulated, which is I want to know what the correct information is. Therefore, I want to go and look at that information. I want to find out what was the source of that information. Do I trust that source of information? Obviously not for every decision I make, but for major ones. And that takes time, it takes resources, it takes effort, it takes cognitive effort. We know that, cognitive effort is something that is scarce and is highly valued. And there is, one of the things I was saying earlier about the shift in the sort of contrarian discussion points from climate change isn't the thing that we need to worry about, to discussion about solution uncertainty, and the EV discussion now is one of those things. There was a paper that was published by John Cook, who's at Melbourne now, who's done lots of really interesting work looking at how he runs a website called Skeptical Science, which looks at all of the kind of standard arguments that people raise for why climate change isn't something that we need to be worried about. And he's done lots of work on characterizing the different arguments that people make. And he had a paper that came out a couple of years ago where they were tracking themes and discussions in sort of right-wing think tanks and blogs, and how there'd been a kind of steady decline in the discussions about just out-and-out climate change denial, and a clear increase in discussions about what they were calling sort of solution uncertainty, or questioning solutions for climate. Now, that those things are, and so when you go and look up the EV and you find stories about batteries going on, the cars blowing up and there being battery fires, or the tires being heavier and losing lots of particles, and that is, that's information that is then out there, and then you do have to start thinking about, well, how do I trust that? Where's that information come from? Who should be the where's the correct one? And if the government is also acutely aware of these kinds of issues. I've had a role the last 8 years, something like that now, working with the behavioural economics team of the Australian government, which is a group that sits in the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, and is about, part of their remit really is to try and develop public policy that is informed by behavioural science and informed by thinking about the ways that people think and the way that they use information. And so they've been, going back to that comparison issue, one of the things, and the project that I was involved in early on, was developing a site for comparing electricity providers and electricity plans, where you can go in and you can put your details of what was your last bill, and what's your current, do you have solar panels and whatever. And then they can list lots of different providers and tell you, these have these attributes, these have those attributes, and try to take some of that onerous part of the decision making out of it for you. And so that reliance on the availability of the brand name or whatever is also backed up then with additional pieces of information that might be harder to find. So it's again leaning into those sort of limitations in cognition that we know people have, or the things that they find hard about making decisions, and trying to overcome it so that you don't just throw it all in the bin and go with whatever you did last time, which is again often what people do. How we can get that to the point of making consuming less the thing that we should be doing. I mean, you would think that because of the difficulties that we all face in making a decision to do something different, it would be a lot easier if we just said, oh well, I don't need that thing, so now I don't have to go out to the shop and get it, and then I will end up consuming less. That would be nice. So it's about, I suppose, increasing the frictions, in the words that you used before, of putting impediments in the way of changing things or getting new things. But at the same time, we're again faced with the marketing of whatever it might be. You got to get up at 4 a.m, 3 days before, to queue outside the Apple store to get the latest Apple phone, which has a different color than the one that you had before. But is otherwise functionally the same. I mean, my optimistic days, I think that we are slowly working towards more of an understanding that is an unsustainable sort of behavior. And the more that these kind of conversations are happening, the more interest people have in thinking about the relationship between what they're doing and what's happening in the world. Maybe we're shifting towards that. There's certainly lots of evidence of increasing concern about climate across the world, although cost of living is also something which seems to be preeminent now above concern about climate in recent polls. But it's there, and it's something that people are thinking about, and hopefully we can get past that or make those connections to see, oh yeah, okay, so maybe if I do, or we as society start consuming less, we've got more of a chance of living sustainably.
I imagine that the behavioral economics factor is interesting to compare across different regions. I know that living in Canberra, there's a strong and large population of public servants, and because of that, the industry is very secure. And I think when there is an economy that I think is generally quite secure because of that fact, that probably is very, very different than a regional town in Queensland. Let's say that with the economic situation at the moment has probably changed a lot of things in terms of how people spend and so on and so forth, and might be easier to somewhat be conscious of climate change if you're not having to battle with your own personal finances.
Yep.
At the same time, I could also see that people who have got a lot of additional funds to work with might potentially go and lean back into the whole consumption space.
Yeah.
Let's go out and add an ensuite to the to the house because it'll be more comfortable to do so. Let's go out and add an extra this and that, and there's this ongoing movement towards consuming more, buying more, using more, replacing more.
Yeah.
So it's interesting to see how economics just play into our own decision making, whether we're conscious of it or not, and then how we behave in that. And also, if I do have a lot of resources, what do I do? People just get extra cars just because they can when they're very, very, very economically, financially secure. Just start doing all sorts of odd things. And obviously we can go to the extremes, but I think even if someone did have an extra $20,000 a year, I can imagine their choices would change and they just start purchasing potentially more. If I project, I don't know if that's true or not, but I think that would be the case.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's certainly the case that having the capacity to really be concerned about climate change and worry about climate change, you could view as a privilege, right? In the sense that it's something that you can only do if you have the mental capacity to represent that as a problem over and above much more fundamental day-to-day, hand-to-mouth living type problems. The really scary part is that it's the people that don't really have the privilege to represent it as a problem, or think about it as a problem, who are going to be most affected by it for precisely the reasons that you're talking about in terms of financial stability. Right? If things start to get really bad, then we can already see it with insurance affordability and where people are living. So if I have a house in an area that is going to be affected by bushfire or flood, which is actually the biggest challenge for Australian households, and I don't have the resources either to pay for my insurance or to do some sort of mitigating action to try and change my house in some way or move somewhere else, then I'm going to be much more severely affected by potential impacts. And so I think that is it's definitely the case. Now, the extent to which having more resources leads me to consume more and buy that extra car or whatever it might be, I mean, I think we can see that. I don't know off the top of my head of data that relates that sort of financial wealth status to. There must be data out there that segments on sort of salary level and climate concern or action. But I could imagine people being in situations where they're saying, well, I do this, therefore I'm allowed to buy myself a car, that kind of moral licensing that people will engage in those situations. I don't know exactly how that plays out, but certainly the other end of the spectrum, the lower socioeconomic status and the impact that's likely to have on people, even though they don't have the resources to deal with it, and when I say resources to deal with it, I mean in terms of mentally, expending energy on thinking about it versus having the physical resources and material resources to adapt or mitigate.
Ben, if I can just shift topic slightly and maybe ask you some personal questions and personal views, if that's okay. From an environmental perspective, from a climate change perspective, from doing what seems to be right in terms of consumption and improving the world for us and the next generation. What are your personal views about good things to do? What should we focus on? I know that this isn't necessarily research based, or it may be from other readings and interests alike. But what would you say, now that we're already on the topic? What can we do?
I think that I mean, this might seem like a cop out, but I think that engaging people in conversations about the issue is one of the really low cost things that we can do. And I find myself increasingly doing it. I was at a 50th birthday party over the weekend and ended up having some quite long and involved conversations about climate related issues with friends, about, what can we do and what's the type of thing that does well. I think having conversations with people, using whatever platform you have to raise the issue as something that needs addressing, whether that be in your local community, whether it be at your workplace, whether it be sending messages to your local MP that this is a message that you're concerned about. I think those things are things that we can do that are, in a sense, lower cost, in that they don't really inconvenience you in the way that people often have the reaction about other sorts of actions that we can take, that they say, oh, that's too hard. So if you say, well, the obvious things like use public transport more if you can, or ride a bicycle if you can, or change the concentration of meat in your diet if you can. These kinds of things that, even if you have only a pretty rudimentary understanding of the links between our behavior and the way the climate is changing, there are things that can reduce emissions. We all know that flying has a very high impact on the amount of emissions that are produced, but I would be, it's very easy to label me as a hypocrite, because I do fly for my work. I flew to New York at the end of last year to participate in a conference, a discussion about climate and cognition at one of the big psychology conferences in the US. And I was addressing a room of, I don't know, maybe 700-800 people. And I kind of owned it right from the start of my presentation and said, you might think this is a bit on the nose that I'm here having. And so I asked the audience, what do you think is my carbon footprint from having done that? And if you don't know, then think about whether that's instructive. Going right back to the start of our conversation about, I don't really know what the impact of X. So, I can create a narrative that's probably pretty bad. Well, how bad? It turns out that my return flight to New York was about a third of the average carbon footprint of an average US citizen, just in a yearly. So the carbon footprint of an average US citizen in a year, I did a third of that in a return flight to New York. Pretty bad.
Why is flying so bad? Is it just the volume of fuel that's being burnt, or is it because the fuel is being released at altitude? What is it?
I think it's a combination of those things, but it's largely the type of fuel that's being used and the amount of fuel that's being used, and the number of people against which you're, it's a per capita emission based on the number of people on the flight. Right? So that's how it becomes such a huge impact. Yeah, I was pretty shocked.
I had no idea. I always heard it's terrible, but see, there's the number sticking for me. It's like, a third of the year. It's like, whoa, and obviously that's a very long haul flight. It's there, it's back. It's quite considerable. But at the same time, immediately, as we do, egocentric, I look at myself, and I did a flight first time in over 10 years with my family to Europe.
Yeah.
And now I'm going, there was 4 of us doing that.
Yeah.
So in combination, 1 point something people, that whole emissions just for that.
No, it adds up. And so, and I think, but so I was weighing that up against going there and talking to a room full of researchers about, and it was a really interesting discussion, actually, going back to having the conversation. It wasn't just research focused, but it was also talking about, well, what are the kinds of things that as an academic you can do, both in terms of advocacy within your own academic circles, in terms of the teaching that you might be able to do, even if your research area, doesn't necessarily have anything to do with climate or climate change.
Yes.
And there's a lot of movement and discussion now about, how can learned societies more generally start becoming advocates for climate? How can the way that those societies operate start to be a bit more climate conscious and think about their own carbon footprint, or the investments that those organizations might have, and how can they be more? And so it was a broad and very vibrant, actually, and good discussion that we had quite a few younger researchers come up afterwards and say, great that the society itself is promoting this conversation and that they're having these kinds of discussions. So yes, the flight was bad. Was it offset by generating, more action in the sense of motivating a next generation of researchers? That's the way I'm going to justify it to me in my own internal narrative.
And to be fair, there's no way to live life without being a hypocrite.
No.
And I think that word is used more often than not in a not so healthy context. I'd comfortably say, even with that information, if someone said, will you change your behavior to go and visit your family in Europe? The answer will be no. I will say, my one life, I'm going to choose that value over all the others, right? And that's exactly what we're all doing.
Yeah.
And this is so much of the major problem. And I think, there are so many layers, that beliefs in the free market. I'd like to hope that technological change does improve flight, in particular with that stat. And almost says, maybe this can be a bit more of a bigger item on the agenda of things that we can do. And this is probably where the Australian government, for example, and many governments around the world have said, hey, let's go and incentivize, whether it's solar panels and roofs and the like. If you put an incentive, we all know that's exactly where people go, even if it's $2,000 back on your installation. That works.
Yeah.
Immensely, and it gets traction and it moves along and so on. So there's lots of things, whether it's on an individual basis, whether it's policy, whether it's incentives, regulations. We all have a part to contribute in all directions. And I think conversations are a great point. So I don't think it's a cop out. I think it's true. And whether it means that what I can do is just keep flying to Europe, but I will put pressure on an MP and say this is important, while I also make some small adjustments myself, so on and so forth. Is it enough? Could I do more? Absolutely.
But
my incentives?
What would be enough, though? I think that's always
exactly right. That's exactly right.
Where does one stop?
Ben, where can people find out more about your work, about this topic, about decision making in this space, and the role of behavioral science to inform climate action and the like? What are some good starting points?
Well, so in terms of finding out more about the work that the UNSW Institute for Climate Risk and Response is currently engaged in, if you just Google that, or I don't know whether you do show like links to web pages.
If you pass on any links from this conversation, we'll put in our show notes, and that way any of the listeners can go and follow that up straight thereafter.
So I'll send some links for that. But if you Google UNSW Institute for Climate Risk and Response, you'll find our webpage, and that's got a lot of information about what we're engaged in, the people that we're currently have working with us. And as I said at the start, that's sort of across not just behavioural people, but also economists and people in law, people in risk and actuarial studies, thinking about the insurance that we were talking about before, insurance affordability. So really trying to understand climate risk from lots of different perspectives, but bringing it all in together to think about what's the right kind of response. In terms of my own research, I've published a couple of books. So I've got a book called Straight Choices, The Psychology of Decision Making, which is in its third edition now. It's published by Psychology Press. Third edition came out in 2022, I think, so it's a few years old now. But it's a sort of introduction to the psychological study of decision making, and it covers a lot of basic information, basic theories about that are relevant for many of the points that we've been discussing today. I also got a book that came out in 2023 with MIT Press called Open Minded, which we haven't talked too much about, but it actually goes back to, you know, this desire for a dichotomy and thinking about the tension between how people make decisions based on what have largely been thought about as unconscious or instinctive processes versus explicit and conscious processes. And this book reviews and takes a kind of critical stance on the idea that the unconscious explains a lot of our decision making and judgment. That's probably a conversation for another day. I think it links into the climate and climate behavior discussion, because if you take the view that a lot of your behavior is somehow controlled by processes outside of your awareness, then it takes away that agency and your ability to change your own behavior, because you can say, well, you know, it wasn't me that did it, it was my brain. No, I didn't know, you know, how to change or what was going on. And I can put a link in for that. It's published by MIT Press, but it's available as an online book, so you can download and read that at your leisure. It also links discussion of the unconscious into the replication crisis and the issues that psychology's had with some of its research practices, which is another interest of mine. And I have my own personal web page as well that has links to all the papers that I've mentioned and those books and the Institute website. So there's a lot of resources out there. I'm also working on a couple of edited books that are going to be related more directly to the climate issue and climate discussion, but you'll have to check back in a year or two until they're ready for consumption.
Open-minded in particular, not saying that the others aren't wonderful as well, but open-minded really catches my attention. It sounds fantastic in terms of, you know, looking at, you know, not only our conscious but our unconscious, you know, biases, the way that we think, and then also even the stories around how we use those to then say, well, you know, how do I now make a decision based on that? I know that I really enjoyed Thinking Fast and Slow. And I think that was put together really well in the language that we use. I think there's something easy in terms about talking about systems, you know, systems too. But how powerful, you know, our biases, I think, is probably one of the greatest interests I have in psychology, is looking at our biases, understanding them, you know, observing them in the first instance, I think is such a large part of I want to use problem, but that's probably not the right word. There's great utility in seeing one's bias, and, you know, whether it's from a clinical sense, which is where I use it, you know, every day, but also with myself. I love observing and appreciating my, you know, I might call it the nonsense, the madness, the crazy, the absurd, because it's just coming to conclusions that just simply aren't there. You know, the simplest ones of confirmation bias, how powerful are they? Constantly there. And I see them in play all the time. Wherever I'm passionate, in particular, is where confirmation bias is strongest. You know, if anyone were to, you know, say negative words around Tesla, as an example, you know, immediately I'll become defensive. I'll say, no, they're a great company, they're doing all this wonderful stuff. Just absurdity, right? Versus saying, no, there's plenty of shortcomings that they also bring. You know, these aren't the you know, the people to put up on the pedestal. At the same time, you can also simultaneously say there's great value that they bring. But it's fascinating to watch yourself and this open-minded.
Open-minded. It's and it's called Searching. The subtitle is Searching for Truth About the Unconscious Mind.
Yeah, wow, that's great. That's great. What inspired you to write that one?
Well, it it's written with a colleague of mine, David Shanks, who's a professor at University College London, and he was my mentor when I did a postdoc there in the early 2000s. And he had done lots of work and continued to do lots of work on sort of questioning these assumptions around implicit learning and unconscious learning. So the thing that I sort of focused on in my PhD, which was the idea that people could acquire kind of complex relationships and learn new associations without having any awareness of those associations in the environment. And those are controversial ideas, and a lot of the work that he'd done and that I'd done in my PhD questioned some of those assumptions and questioned that kind of strong case that the unconscious can make decisions for us and learn new things for us. And one of the reasons that we wrote the book was that we saw kind of in certain areas of psychology increasingly strong claims being made for the role that the unconscious was used in explaining people's behavior. So it's interesting that you talk about biases and whether they're unconscious or conscious, because there's a lot of things written about the idea of unconscious bias. And one of the issues that we tackle in the book is, again, that the evidence that those biases are genuinely unconscious, or whether we're conscious of them but we're not sort of willing to acknowledge them, or that they feel wrong in some way, and that labeling them as unconscious, going back to this point, is sort of allowing an abdication of responsibility for them. And that's dangerous, I think. And so one of the arguments that we make is that the kind of evidence that people use for there being unconscious bias, and you probably come across this implicit attitude test, the IAT, which is supposed to reveal the extent to which you show these kinds of biases, and it's been questioned, and the evidence is not super supportive of it being unconsciously mediated. And so we sort of reviewed a lot of that evidence, other evidence that in fact comes up in Thinking Fast and Slow, that Kahneman subsequently kind of pulled back from, because he realized that a lot of the work that he'd cited in some of those chapters talking about this impacts of unconscious and priming and automatic effects. So one of the classic sort of experiments is the one where you read some anagram, you unscramble some anagrams about old people that are related to elderly people, and then you're surreptitiously measured how long it takes you to walk down a corridor after having unscrambled these sentences. And the idea is that having activated concepts of age, you walk more slowly down the corridor than a person who had solved anagrams that had nothing to do with age, right? And there was then this whole idea built around unconscious activation and how that influenced behavior. But those kinds of experiments have been extremely difficult to replicate.
Sure.
And that then links to this replication crisis. And so the point of the book was to say unconscious explanation has had this prominence that we argue is not, that it shouldn't have, that it's the too much is being put on these kind of unconscious explanations. And furthermore, a lot of the evidence has been disproportionately come from studies that have then failed to replicate. So there's sort of been this over preponderance of, and when you look at it, it comes back to that, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And when you say to people, you might not think this, but holding a cold can of Coke versus a cup of coffee completely changes your evaluation of someone's personality in a 2-second encounter. You think, that doesn't sound right to me. And it turns out it's not right, because it's not replicated and the evidence isn't there. So, some people have said that the book is a bit naysayerish and a bit negative, but I actually think it's the opposite. I think it's providing, again, that idea of agency, that yes, we do have a bit more control. We're not just being wafted around and our circumstances are changing the decisions that we're making all the time. There is a part of that that's going on, but it's not. And to go back to this prominence of dichotomies in a lot of the discussion. The system 1, system 2 is a good example of that. That it's very easy to communicate, but it's a simplification, and it's a simplification that sometimes is useful because it I think Kahneman used it as a device to say, if you are thinking like an economist, in inverted commas, and you think people make rational, explicit, deliberative decisions all the time, then the idea that there may be something a little bit more reactionary, more intuitive, however you want to interpret that word, it's a useful juxtaposition. But then people have, I think, overlaid that and said, oh, well, no, there are these two systems. System 1 is here and system 2 is here, and I'm going to design an experiment which talks to this bit and not that. That's nonsense. It's a simplification that maybe helps some discussion, but we argue in the book that it's potentially taken too far, and then be used. It starts to obfuscate rather than illuminate.
I think I'll be certainly purchasing my own personal copy, because that sounds absolutely brilliant. And I think the I won't call it the pub test, but if I call it the legal test, there is no way that I'd like to believe so, that in a courtroom I'd be able to say, my apologies, Your Honor. I had an unconscious bias, and that is the reason why my actions were such. And on that basis, I therefore wasn't responsible. And so, I appreciate you being understanding of that and lenient towards, well, no, you don't even have to have leniency, because it wasn't me. And, interestingly, there's no reason for any rehabilitation, because that responsibility has been removed from me, and off we go. So it doesn't fit. I think you're right. The overlay of simplifying and then trying to I think language is really important in all of this, and that's probably where being very considered is also important about what are we going out and messaging. One of my passions, not that I am a linguist or anything like that, but probably a scientist practitioner more so, or at least I love the model, is really going out and saying, what's the actual message? Is it valid? Is it accurate? What do the words represent? It's like the classic in psychology at the moment. The word depression has been used so poorly. Anxiety is another classic one. The clinical terms used flippantly to express feeling upset, feeling annoyed, feeling sad, feeling frustrated. Everything is now depressed. If you're disappointed, it's no longer disappointed, I'm depressed. If you're apprehensive, a bit nervous, a bit worried about what might happen, then I'm immediately anxious. There's no more room for nuance, and I think that's what psychologists are trying to build every day, of saying, let's slow it down in a quiet room and pull these things apart, because otherwise we're catastrophizing, and all the good old, not that I'm a CBT therapist, but they're all still very valid. Looking at all the automatic negative automatic thoughts. We can see they're occurring in many of us. Assumptions being one of them, overgeneralization, black and white, etc. I think there's such value in thinking about these, and open-minded sounds wonderful. I'll be buying myself a copy of that.
Well, I hope you enjoy it. I'd be very interested to hear your feedback or your thoughts on it. I actually had, I don't know whether I'm allowed to ask a question, but I did have a question about so you're talking about anxiety being a term that's overused, and one of the things, going back to the climate issue, that's becoming more and more prominent there is this notion of climate anxiety. And I've got a PhD student, Sam Figueroa, who's working with a clinical colleague of mine, Michelle Moulds, who he's just finished his first year, and he's basically been doing a big review of lots of different measures of broadly construed eco distress, with which climate anxiety is one of them. But climate, I mean, I'm not a clinician, but climate anxiety seems to me to be a term that is sort of running ahead of its evidential base, and it's getting talked about a lot, and people say, oh yeah, I've got climate, I've got climate anxiety. What does that mean? And my colleague Michelle is of your opinion, I think, in saying, these are terms that have clinical significance. They have implications for the kinds of treatment that they imply. Whatever your particular treatment type of treatment is, and is it the fact that climate anxiety is a thing which is independent, or is it something that people who are perhaps predisposed to being anxious are now linking climate as the thing that they're anxious about? Or how does that relationship kind of, how should we think about it? And also, should it be, in a standard case of anxiety, it's often something which people are finding, if they're seeking treatment for it, it's because they find it debilitating, they find it affecting their everyday life, and it's something that should be reduced. In the climate case, is there something to be said for there being an optimal level of climate anxiety, in that maybe it starts to motivate action? And there are some studies linking that concern or worry, as you might expect, to more willingness to do things about it. So it's a highly active area of research at the moment, and I don't know whether you've come to it at all, or what.
I can only talk from my own personal experience. I haven't had a single client that I have worked with on a climate anxiety basis.
Right.
I think that says something itself. If there was such a thing that we could term climate anxiety, we would then need to go out and also add a whole lot of other terms, such as financial anxiety, political anxiety, relationship breaking down anxiety.
Yeah.
It would relate to many things. I think what maybe is trying to be expressed is I've got very genuine, serious concerns about all the reports that I'm hearing about how this overconsumption world is impacting the environment. And because I have capacity to think about these things, it's front of mind.
I
think for most people, it's actually not that front of mind that they end up seeing a psychologist for, but it is something that they are highly interested in, and particularly for younger persons who, when we have these idealisms that come from being youthful, I think that brings lots of worries and concerns, and I think that's a wonderful thing. But the term, climate anxiety, I think, is a clumsy use of language. Are there people genuinely distressed by it? Yes. I don't think I've seen too many. My apologies. I've seen no situations of it being of that kind of like clinical range where I can't go out and I function as a human being because of it. And I think it would be more momentary. I think it would be very social in nature. It would be a group of people getting together and saying, we're really distressed about this. It's really upsetting. But then we also get into the next following thing of our day, which is probably our studies or our work or our friends, our family, other responsibilities, obligations, and the like. So for me, I think it's a bit of pop, TikTok, new language that's coming up. But we shouldn't dismiss it as being something of great concern. And in here lies the problem. If we don't, there's this kind of like impression of, if we don't give it the word anxiety, or, is what you're saying, Mr. Nikolic, is that, no one's upset about it. We get this kind of dichotomy nonsense going on. And I think this is where
it's not to diminish it in any sense. It's not
the nuances are lost in life these days, and this is why I like these types of conversations.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. I think the point about it being, something that's front of mind, and therefore, to add to your list of, financial anxiety, relationship breakdown. One fun fact that came out of Sam's review of all of these different measures was that one of the ones that's currently in use, I can't remember which one it is now, but some of the items that they used to develop the measure came from a Y2K anxiety scale.
Beautiful.
Your reaction is perfect, right? Is that what? Did people really worry about that? Yeah, that was huge. 25 years ago, people thought the world was going to end.
And you can see this is where that messaging, the chaos, clearly, clickbait 101. This is a perfect, beautiful moment to go out and try and get viewership.
Yeah.
And so off we go. And it's well, yeah. I was a different age at that time, but I thought it was hysterically funny at that time because it was so absurd in nature, but for whatever reason, it sold. People bought programs and all sorts of stuff, and
I just read an article about it just the other day that there apparently is still debate about whether it was a complete overreaction and it was never going to be a thing that was going to be a problem, or it wasn't a problem because lots of people spent hours and hours of very boring reviewing of code to make sure that the thing that they were worried about happening didn't happen. And apparently there's still not really a clear answer to that question, which I find in itself amazing.
Yeah. Look, I think if there was something in it, the Microsofts of the world would have been panicking, and they weren't. And in actual fact, like what we have today, but I think it's on steroids at the moment, is these platforms, like, there's always social media platforms that can blow up the 0.00001% of the population is getting headlines. And in actual fact, it's not even that. It's media making claims that just aren't real. When they say the internet has blown up, no, they haven't. Yeah. You just said that. You haven't gone out and done a sample of internet users, which is called the whole population. It's sensationalism and the rest of it. But this plays into climate action in messaging and the like. And this is why I think this propensity of this repetition, coming from whether it's Y2K or anywhere else, continues, and that's the concern. And using words like climate anxiety, I think it's harming. That language has a negative net value. And we can description is important. That comes from my passion of acceptance and commitment therapy. And I think, many psychological therapies probably still hold, a similar approach as well. Let's describe concerns, problems, and the like, rather than label them in a clinical term, because the label does not give it any additional value or understanding for anyone. It's an easy term I can flick to my GP, and that's helpful because efficiency and let's be quick. They don't need to know all the detail. But most of the time it's unhelpful. But no, thank you for the question. Always open to discussing these things. You can see where my passions come from.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I thought it would be. I was interested in your perspective on that. It's good.
Ben, thank you so much. I really appreciate your time. Very fascinating. I'll be grabbing a copy of Open Minded. Where can people get a copy of that?
You can get it from the MIT Press website, or you can get it, I think, through online booksellers.
Excellent.
Which there are a number.
Lovely. Well, after the show, please share all those links and the like, and then listeners can go to neshnikolic.com and find the episode there, and click through for there. And once again, big appreciation for your time and effort, and I appreciate what you do as well, in terms of messaging and informing how we do messaging, across this space around climate, but I think across the board as well. I think there's real importance in understanding behavioral economics in a wide book, in basically everything. So, appreciate your time and your work, and please keep doing what you do, because we need lots of people like yourself, being part of that conversation and informing.
Well, thank you. Thanks for the opportunity to have one of these important conversations. It's been great.